Hello everyone, this is Ginny Lobel with Defined Health, and we welcome you to another of our Insight Series webinars. Today, Jeff Bachman, PhD, Senior Consultant, Vice President for Defined Health, will present, Jeff, you got demoted, a pre-Cancer Progress 2014 high-level snapshot of challenges and opportunities in the oncology market. Defined Health is pleased to bring you these webinar presentations as a way of showcasing how we view and think looking forward about various critically relevant topics for the biopharmaceutical industry. Our viewpoint is the result of our long history of consulting with hundreds of pharma, specialty pharma, biotech, and investor clients. In these engagements, we bring our unique perspective, grown over 30 years of evaluating pipeline and inline opportunities by bridging our knowledge of drug development, business development, and commercial strategy across multiple therapeutic categories and technology platforms. I just want to quickly call your attention to two of our in-person events happening in March of 2014. The meeting announcements are up on the screen. First, on March 4th and 5th, 2014 in New York, Defined Health will present the 25th Annual Cancer Progress Conference. I encourage you to visit our website, cancerprogressbydh.com, to view the program. Jeff's going to go over a little bit of it at some point in his webinar. The meeting brings together world-class oncology luminaries from academia and industry, investors, and regulatory agencies. The agenda ranges from biomarkers, diagnostics, and big data to advances in treating brain and prostate cancer, to antibody drug conjugates, gene and cell therapies, translational oncology, and pricing and reimbursement. Again, check it out at cancerprogressbydh.com. Secondly, Therapeutic Insight by Defined Health will be held at EBD Group's BioEurope Spring Partnering Conference, and that will take place March 10th through 12th in Turin, Italy. Our 4 sessions this year feature senior industry executives from pharma, biotech, and specialty pharma speaking about, first, establishing proof of relevance in early-stage deal-making. Second, cognition disorders across the CNS space. Third, differentiating early in the autoimmune inflammatory disease space. And finally, immuno-oncology. To learn more about Defined Health, our capabilities, and our upcoming annual Therapeutic and Cancer Progress Conferences, Therapeutic Insight and Cancer Progress Conferences, please visit our website at definedhealth.com or send us an email. Give us a call. We'll be happy to tell you more. The slides will be up on the website shortly. We may or may not have questions at the end of Jeff's presentation. You can send your questions digitally as they come to you. We'll try to answer them live at the end of the presentation, but if we can't, we'll get back to you individually. Thank you. Enjoy the presentation. Jeff, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Ginny. Thank you, everyone, for huddling around your screens for warmth on this continuing cold day, at least here on the East Coast. This is an update of a presentation that I gave in May. So some of you perhaps had seen that earlier one. This has been kind of tweaked and updated a bit to reflect some recent changes, but it's materially the same. And as Ginny and the title indicated, it's really a high-level snapshot of some of the kind of the major issues and changes, challenges, and opportunities that are going on in oncology right now. As Ginny mentioned, please send any questions along the way and through the chat window. If we have time at the end, we'll obviously discuss those live, and if not, we'll address those separately with each of you afterwards. Disclaimer, of course, these are our opinions based on available data as well as our speculation. My usual disclaimer about who I am not. I won't spend time on that today. And I thought I'd start this session with some new slides, really, being positive about the oncology market, because clearly, it's been leading in terms of many disease areas in terms of approval, and frankly, I think everyone in the field has a lot to be to be proud, and certainly patients are increasingly have a lot to be hopeful about. This is just a snapshot of approvals in 2012, both new approvals and kind of extensions below the line, just to kind of show you the degree of activity. And that's a fair amount of approvals. That was in 2012. And of course, whoa, the technical issue going on. And then, of course, in 2013, we also had a nice number of new approvals and kind of new in-class or next-in-class agents across a spectrum of mechanisms. And, of course, in the beginning of this year, we had the approval for the combined use of what had previously been approved for GSK of the two inhibitors, MEK and RAF, for targeting the metastatic melanoma mutated patients. So clearly a lot of activity, a lot of approvals going on in oncology. But as we'll discuss, there still remains a lot to do in terms of moving forward novel mechanisms, in terms of addressing the unmet needs, not only in many of the more well-established and larger markets, but many of the smaller and niche and somewhat underserved tumor segments that are getting more and more onto biopharma's radar screen, but still have a long way to go. So I want to talk first about some of the interesting new challenges going on in oncology. That's the kind of the segue from the kudos to the crowded space that is the oncology market now. As I'm sure all of you know, I mean, oncology still remains a leading area for drug development in the biopharma industry. A very outsized amount of development across the spectrum from phase 1 through late stage. And I think one of the consequences of this, as we'll talk about, is that what had once long ago been a relatively sleepy area defined by a relatively limited number of agents has now blossomed into a very active category with a large number of approved agents, as we just indicated, a very large category of blockbuster agents by all methods of measure, but also intensely competitive. And so as oncology remains data-driven, nonetheless, there are increasing challenges in differentiating agents with those data, given kind of the bars that are being set and the noise that are in particularly some very well-established and perhaps over-chased categories like VEGF inhibitors and others. As a snapshot of just overall activity, one can see that it is really the solid tumors that, again, kind of constitute the lion's share of activity. And as I'll show a little bit later, it is, predominantly driven by activity in kind of the major 4 or 5 tumor types. But that being said, the heme malignancies are very much front and center on most major pharma categories on franchises for a variety of reasons, not the least of which, of course, is that there are some, very outsized current and anticipated blockbuster drugs in what are relatively small patient settings, and so that is continuing to generate a lot of interest. And so here's just a snapshot of kind of the top 10 oncology blockbusters going forward, and you can easily see where the heme malignancies of agents are: Revlimid, Rituxan, Tasigna, Sprycel. So, for the top 10, clearly, in the heme space, really disproportionate then to, if you add up those, the epidemiology on those diseases relative to the solid tumors. And, it's not only that, these oncology drugs are, so significant, in the enclosed world of oncology, they are also significant contributors to the revenue of their owner companies. And as you see, they contribute 3 out of the top 10 drugs now and projected in 2018 within the overall biopharma industry, and specifically I'm talking here about Avastin, Rituxan, and Herceptin. Of course, all those do happen to be Genentech-Roche programs, but nonetheless, that just emphasizes again the dominance and importance of oncology as a franchise space, as a therapeutic area within the industry. And I do want to emphasize, as the title notes, that there are a variety of ways, both in ancient history in oncology, in more recent past history, and kind of going forward, that these oncology blockbusters have been built, historically to a great degree out of expanding the labels, getting multiple lines of therapy in a given indication, moving into horizontally into other new indications, different combinations of agents, but also increasingly the idea of chronic use, as in CML, or repeat and chronic use, say as in Rituxan or maintenance type settings, and of course the somewhat more problematic issue of the very high pricing that a number of these drugs have commanded, and newer ones are trying to command, and we'll touch on that in a little bit. And I put in parenthetically the idea of their kind of the increasingly high pricing in the unique patient subsets, because that may be one way of addressing some of the challenges and controversies that are associated with the pricing that some of these drugs have faced. But as I alluded to before, one of the issues here is that although there is a huge amount of pipeline development across a diverse range of mechanisms, still at the end of the day, it's a lot of chasing the big major cancers, and it's not to say that those don't have remaining unmet needs. In many cases they do, but the highest unmet needs are often in smaller select populations. So here you can see a plot of kind of incidence of patients versus the rate of death and mortality rates, and then plotted with the line of the actual clinical development activity. You can see how, by and large, with the major cancers of prostate, breast, lung, and colorectal, that that's where a lot of the activity is. But you can also see the outsized the outsized degree of unmet need, say, that lung cancer has. Of course, there is a spike there in terms of development, but relative to unmet need, again, using as a surrogate of that unmet need, the death rates that prostate and breast, are not quite up there like lung is in terms of year or 5-year survival, and yet the development activity is still on par with those. And then there are some smaller tumor settings where there clearly is a high amount of activity. I don't want to say disproportionate, but certainly leukemias, areas such as AML, where there's a lot of activity because the unmet need is so high. That's a roll-up of leukemia, so it doesn't truly reflect the degree of unmet need, say, in a setting like AML, or particularly acute AML. And then there are others that continue to need much further activity, such as ovarian and pancreatic, where the outcomes overall remain quite dire, and the options are limited for patients, particularly in pancreatic cancer, although there are a number of interesting approaches moving forward, including immunotherapy. And this isn't just, that was kind of a US-centric slide, but just looking at kind of the disability-adjusted life years from the Lancet analysis across other regions in the world, you can kind of see the degree of contribution to human health that these various different cancers contribute to, whether the key ones like prostate in many areas, or colorectal, lung, etc. So with all that drug development activity in oncology, one of the interesting aspects of cancer has been the degree to which the first-in-class drugs have historically managed, by and large, to maintain their position, and whether that is because these first-in-class are best-in-class, or historically somewhat, only and lonely in class, I might say, with with limited direct challenges, say, to some of the biologics, and only more recently, say, as Vectibix challenging an Erbitux, or Zira challenging Rituxan, or Zaltrap challenging an Avastin. But as we'll talk about, one of the issues, whether with those biologics or with the small molecules challenging these first-in-class agents, is, not only does one have the bar of trying to show some meaningful clinical differentiation and value above and beyond, what you need for approval, but for interesting, the oncologist in using these agents, but you also need to be able to really differentiate them, not just on that one data set, but on the historical mountain of data that these agents have accumulated, which provides a level of comfort, not a false level of comfort, but a real meaningful barrier, I think, to later entrants. Now, some of that is changing, and we'll touch on that in a little bit as kind of next-in-class agents come along. However, the attempt to analyze the meaning of that is a little skewed, because in many of these cases, the next-in-class or even best-in-class agents are being brought out by the originators in the first place. So, you have the triple threat that Genentech Roche has around HER2-positive breast cancer. You have, say, Novartis with their own follow-on to Cigna for Gleevec. So it creates a very interesting situation for new players trying to break in. And part of what's behind this issue of these first-in-class and best-in-class, and kind of ties in the theme of how crowded the clinical development pipeline is in oncology, is that the timelines are speeding up between those follow-on products, which is a function not only of kind of how fast people are able to kind of move drugs along in some of these subset settings where, they are more tractable to quick trials, particularly where they are being developed to mutations that are arising as a result of the first-in-class or first-generation agents. So you have a very defined subset population, whether for the imatinib-resistant patients, for the various drugs that have come into that place from Novartis and BMS, Ariad and others, as well as, all the follow-ons that are coming into the melanoma space for BRAF beyond the Roche Plexicon agents, such as GSK's two agents individually and together, and now a number of agents chasing Pfizer in the ALK mutation, ALK translocation setting of lung cancer, and following on to crizotinib. So this creates a very, very interesting dynamic where you have whether it's ranging from broad agents that are not kind of stratified, like the whole range of MTKIs targeting VEGF and angiogenesis that are chasing, established small molecule players and Avastin, or the more stratified areas where there's still a large number of players chasing those mutant and resistant populations resulting from use of these first-generation drugs. And I'll touch on that a little later in the talk in the context of the idea of, what it takes to show proof of relevance in oncology. Of course, here's just a snapshot of some of the ALK inhibitor activity that's going on, and that's a fair amount of activity, given we're talking about 5% of the population being, ALK mutated, and crizotinib, capturing those, and then getting the resistant patients then amenable for these trials. Now, some of these patients, some of these trials will ultimately aim to displace, not to follow on to Xalkori. But I think what this also illustrates, is the, and this is known well to all of you in attendance, is kind of the strategy to balance out this issue of this competitive intensity and the broad label, as well as to improve the value proposition around the pricing and the kind of the efficacy bar, or the incremental advanced clinical benefits that these agents might have, of course, is the biomarker and stratification of patients. But that has its own complexities at the end of the day, because if you're talking about developing a whole range of drugs and slicing and dicing what was once considered, say, a monolithic entity, differentiated by, squamous and adeno, and is now being kind of subsetted into a variety of small percentage mutation-defined patient populations, and for each of those, you have a half dozen or a dozen agents and companies kind of chasing those down and buying, then you could argue at the end of the day that one's created perhaps an even bigger and more complicated market, just say in the case of lung cancer, than there was before, and maybe even, when all is said and done and you add up, the sales for all these, you may have and the prices, you may have a much more expensively managed type of lung cancer. Now, hopefully, falling out in all this is actually that one will have a much better managed patient with these individual mutated forms of lung cancer, but it remains to be seen how durable and how meaningful those clinical benefits will be. And just getting a month or two without getting into the whole issue of the importance that is for any individual patient, but on a kind of population and a societal and public health basis, it starts to get a little more dicey, pun intended. And that, of course, is related to this issue that we are faced with a situation where when you look at the advances that we are having in oncology, we are still, in most cases, only providing incremental benefits, incremental improvement in life. Again, judging overall, and I know, we can have a whole session talking about, not getting caught up in discussions around median survival, et cetera, but nonetheless, as a way to carry out these discussions, one does these analyses, and one can see at the end of the day that kind of the benefits by these individual agents, or starting to combine them into regimens, still leaves a lot to be desired in terms of dramatically shifting the outcomes for patients. Again, there are exceptions to that, whether it's and part of that may be driven by diagnostic regimens and early diagnosis in breast cancer, coupled with very good therapeutic options, or the situation with CML and the phenomenal impact that imatinib and the other BCR-ABL inhibitors have been able to promulgate. But for most cancers, that's not been the case. And of course, with all that amount of clinical development activity and discovery that's going on around, novel targets, next generation targets, reformulations, et cetera, across a whole spectrum of mechanisms, we're still doing this all in the context in oncology where it's been a very high failure rate, low phase transition rates. This is just a snapshot of a variety of different ways of looking at it, segmented by phase transitions on the top from recap, on the bottom left by kind of the reason for anticipated failures by different disease areas, and on the right, just an oncology-focused, another snapshot of kind of failure rates, overall analysis from Nature Reviews drug discovery. But, at the end of the day, these all tell the similar story that there is a very high failure rate. So, the flip side is that, therefore, we need to have a very crowded oncology pipeline because it takes a lot to get some of these across the finish line. The caveat, of course, is that, much of this data is based on, some historical analysis, because that's the only way you have enough data, and the nature of development has been changing over the past few years, and so the development of these agents to, biomarker-defined patient populations, et cetera, as well as increasing use of targeted agents, whether biologics or otherwise, are certainly going to kind of change, or one would anticipate would change some of these rates, and we do know that biologics do have a better chance of approval, and I'm sure recent analyses will show that some of these stratified agents will have higher rates of success as well. But it does raise the interesting question of, what happens to all those drugs that are in clinical development? Even if they all fail, and if you do kind of what I call fun with math, or the attrition rate riddle, if you do all the math using some of these rates, whether from Biomed Tracker or from other publications, and you apply them across the sheer number of compounds there are by phase, you still end up with a lot of drugs that can't conceivably come to market. So we know that there are other forms of attrition going to have to occur along the way, above and beyond, what's reflected in this numbers game, whether those are commercial decisions, the failure of those companies to, have enough financial runway, et cetera, and also, the sheer competitiveness in the category of some of these drugs. This doesn't even take into account, which of those will ultimately be commercially successful. So it's still a numbers game in oncology, still data-driven, still the need for a lot of drug development, but it does beg the question of, are there too many drugs, or in some cases, is the distribution of those drugs by targets and mechanisms perhaps not optimized? Again, I alluded to the number of drugs just chasing VEGF, and others have already touched on this before around ASCO, particularly Bruce Booth. So we're in a situation where oncology, which previously had been considered pretty much sacrosanct, no one had to really think about the pricing of their drugs. Basically, you could kind of do what you wanted in industry, and as a clinician had access to what drugs you wanted to use. But the new equation, this issue of value versus cost of drugs, the incremental benefit. So again, we're not talking about just what it takes to get approved. We're talking about the complicated questions now of what it takes to get used above and beyond the value of the data, meaning the increasingly important role of the payer, whether that's government in some regions or private or a mix of those. And of course, so right now we have the good being all these new drugs, even in this past 2 years of 2012 and 13 that I talked about at the beginning getting approved, and now we're facing a situation where there's increasing competition. The markets are crowded. Some of these agents may be only thinly differentiated, and we have payers starting to draw lines in the sand about what these drugs need to do to be meaningfully differentiated for their reimbursement. And so the market access is becoming more and more of an issue. Not going to get in the near term, perhaps like NICE in the UK, but we are certainly moving into an area where there is scrutiny, and there's going to be some type of decision-making that occurs in terms of the pricing and the allocation and the choice of the drugs to use. And this is driven by a whole range of analyses. I'm not going to go into too much detail here because I'm not an economist, but from what one can read in literature and certainly glean, the overall cost is going up. The cost of individual drugs are going up. The overall cost of management is going up. And at the end of the day, while in some cases, as I said, there may be some outsized outcomes where you might argue, maybe the price should be even more. In many other cases, drugs of a comparable cost to those that are having these outsized effects are being used in settings where the clinical benefits are much more legitimately called incremental. Again, speaking overall on a population basis. So, one of the prime examples that I like to use is CRC, and you can see, Dr. Saltz, Lenny Saltz himself, kind of getting up and grandstanding about some of these issues. I think the main point is that there have been important advances. There are important lives that have been saved and extended for patients. But when you kind of look at the degree of an improvement by adding on these different regimens, many of components now are going generic, but certainly the biologic components have not. We're talking about a rise in the cost of managing those patients that is way disproportionate to the improvement in their outcomes. I expressed it as the difference of exponential increase in price versus arithmetic increase in survival, but the point is simply to say that there is going to be some type of need, whether that's imposed or whether it comes from organically, for trying to think about how to price and to use these agents. And of course, there's also some, not just the the lay, not the actual patients demanding or making demands or issues around these and out-of-pocket expenses, et cetera, not just payers, but also the oncologists and the institutions themselves are making more and more noise. And I don't need to go into detail on this other than to say that now it's a new situation where, yes, there have been voices in the oncology literature over the past decade kind of raising this issue of pricing, but the level of noise, both qualitatively and quantitatively, has gone up, whether it's this issue with Sloan Kettering around Zaltrap, whether it's the blood article around the BCR-ABL inhibitors, whether it's issues of market access, again, not just in the U.S., not specifically U.S., but in NICE around agents like Xalkori, which presumably because of that stratified nature, one would hope would have a kind of a better value proposition. But again, that's partly dependent on what those outcomes are and how those are defined against other populations. And so you have a situation where it's not a given anymore that some of these drugs, which we might argue are kind of very much at the forefront and are game-changing and have a strong value proposition, are still facing challenges in terms of their market access. I'm not going to argue about whether those are legitimate challenges or not, but nonetheless, those are challenges that are going to have to be faced. And of course, there's increasing approaches that people are looking at, that the payers are looking at in terms of clinical pathways or other ways ultimately that move towards some type of capitation and rationalization of use. Again, not the area that we necessarily focus in, but clearly an important area that we need to think about, and with our market access partners particularly need to focus on, and almost every oncology assessment we're doing these days has a market access component where 5 years ago it was the rarity to do so. So clearly these pressures are increasing, and one needs to have now this differentiation, this idea of evidence-based medicine for oncology. That's a given, right? It's always been about data. It's always been about evidence-based. Many other disease areas perhaps less so, but the degree of crowdedness that many of these areas have, many of the mechanisms and tumor types have, suggests that data to differentiate may not always be so dramatic and may be rather thin, and raises the questions of, will those agents get approved? If they get approved, will they get paid for? And even if they get paid for, at the end of the day, how will the clinicians kind of decide and discriminate between these closely appearing agents? And again, one of the presumptive strategies for addressing that value proposition, for building it into the drug, building it into the clinical development programs, building it into the actual utilization for patients, are these biomarkers and very personalized ways of segmenting patients, the foundation medicines, et cetera, to try and develop a story around the reason why a given drug or a given set of drugs and regimen is the best for a given patient, and therefore has a better value proposition and a better reason why that should be used for the patient's benefit and hopefully would be reimbursed. But kind of pulling this all together, this kind of dynamic tension that's kind of existing and hasn't really existed before in oncology between what I just, kind of half-jokingly call, kind of niche-ification and PCP-ification. Clearly, oncology is never going to be like a PCP market, but the point is really to emphasize that, on the one hand, you have, this rush of agents targeting the same mechanisms, targeting the same cancers, very much like what has gone on historically in the PCP markets, issues of kind of thin differentiation and incremental value, leading to the ability to start to question, oh, should this drug be used or not? Whereas in oncology, that didn't used to be. It used to be, the unmet needs were so high that any drug across the finish line would, A, get approved and B, be used, even if it had, say, only 2 weeks or several weeks of improvement in outcomes. And kind of balancing that out is this kind of niche-ification, these focus on these molecularly defined subsets, which of course fits neatly within the whole biopharma interest within, rare disease and specialist settings, and the matching of the patients and so on, and where presumably one will have, again, that better value proposition of these niche segments, therefore having better chance of success in trials, better signal to noise, better activity displayed, hopefully better therapeutic window and index, and hopefully a better kind of pharmacoeconomic argument and kind of pricing power, but as mentioned before, that this is turning out to not always be a case. So in other words, it's not a given that one can presume that those drugs, targeted agents developed in those niche settings will necessarily equate with the immediate market access and reimbursement. So, we've been talking about collectively defined health across all the therapeutic areas, the idea of proof of relevance. Of course, it's an interesting question to talk about in oncology because, as we all know and talked about, it's data-driven, and so if you can demonstrate some activity, particularly in the defined population, whether that's defined by refractory resistant, relapsed patients, or defined by now increasingly mutations, which clearly are underpinning some of these resistant patient settings, then you presumably have a kind of a better story for why there's a clinical relevance. But to borrow kind of just the nice equations that a former client, Steve Heller at J&J, had put together, I think it's increasingly apparent that activity does not equal efficacy, that efficacy does not necessarily guarantee you approval, that even if you get across that approval line, it doesn't necessarily equate with the fact that you're going to get reimbursed or market access, or that you're going to get necessarily utilized. And that also goes back to that issue of kind of those follow-on agents I talked about before, because it's, if your incremental benefit is thin or marginal, may or may not be efficacy, it may be an issue of safety, tolerability, or dosing, and you're talking about trying to displace an entrenched player with a huge amount of data across, many different lines of therapy and regimens, et cetera, in that tumor type, let alone just more broadly, it's not so readily done as it might be in other disease areas. And because we have so many agents in oncology kind of being approved and chasing, again, many of these same targets and tumors, it's getting much more complicated than it ever has been. So that real need to clinically differentiate in a meaningful way. And so, I think one can easily get tripped up when talking about incremental. There's an incremental benefits depending on the tumor type that can be meaningful. And then there are incremental benefits that are truly just thinly differentiated and don't really have that traction. So I think we want to be careful when talking about incremental benefits. So, the industry in oncology certainly, and broadly, but specifically this has been tweaked for oncology from one of a head of our company, Ed Saltzman's slides on POR, that, this idea of moving from areas where there's high unmet need and no prior therapies and moving into spaces where, you're getting higher and higher hurdles because there's an entrenched standard of care, et cetera. For oncology, we're also seeing this has been a change within the regulatory environment and increasingly now in the overall kind of market access and utilization environment as we have moved from old response rates to progression-free survival to overall survival and increasingly to health economics and outcomes research and endpoints, which can also include, quality of life issues. But at the end of the day, trying to make sure that the focus remains on trying to have clinically meaningful differentiation, which again is going to vary from setting to setting, and there are bars where that may be legitimately lower, but even in those settings like pancreatic cancer where it may be legitimately lower, that's not to say that the regulatory environment or the payer environment or the physician and institution environment of the end users is such that a 2-week benefit would be acceptable. So even in these areas we might call as having relatively low bars, the bars are not as low, nor should they be as low as they used to be. And I already alluded to Bruce Booth's issue about everyone kind of chasing the VEGF agents and some of the issues there, so I don't need to go over that again other than to say that, trying to differentiate here if you've got the 5th or 10th or 70th, as I jokingly say here, VEGF agent is not that easy, and you can kind of look to what's going on with the MTKIs as well as with the mTORs in RCC to kind of see how kind of jockeying for position in a very crowded space, particularly relative to the epidemiology, creates an interesting little case study there that is quite different than many other tumor types where you don't have that range of at least modern targeted therapeutic options jostling for position, ultimately all trying to displace what has continued to be the first-line choice of sunitinib. And of course, this idea of proof of relevance is somewhat baked into many of these oncology drugs that we've been talking about in light of the kind of patient stratification and kind of the targeting of these mutated targets and the patients that have those, and whether it's the speed of development that gets reflected as with Plexicon, the speed of approval, the kind of the forecast for these agents, or as one of the earlier slides I showed, or the speed with which the follow-on agents come chasing along to demonstrate activity in the resistant patients, which we will almost all cases have, in some cases sooner rather than later. So the durability of these remissions can be rather limited in some cases, thus setting up a market potential for those follow-ons. And in some cases, those follow-ons will be such mechanistically that they'll be able to move forward and displace the first-in-class, first-generation agent. And that's certainly well exampled with what Novartis has been able to do, has been trying to do with Tasigna, say, relative to Gleevec, relative to a generic imatinib. And so these fast followers are chasing along, whether in the small molecule space, and examples again here of the BRAF inhibitors or the BCR-ABL agents, or still continuing an activity in the EGFR space. And so while Vectibix is doing okay, but nowhere near what the expectations were relative to Erbitux, the unmet needs and the belief in the value of targeting EGF remain. And so one is able to see with kind of that classic oncology deal, that classic oncology demonstration of not only just proof of concept, but the implicit proof of clinical relevance when you demonstrate activity in a resistant population, whether you're targeting a mutation, whether you're targeting a different epitope, as in the case of the Symphogen story for 004 that then led to the deal with Merck KGaA. At the end of the day, you at least have a story that allows this early deal because you're making a case that this is going to be, that is, at least at this point, preclinically differentiated, with the hypothesis that will translate into some hopefully meaningful clinical differentiation, enough that these large pharma companies who are placing bets earlier and earlier, particularly in oncology, will be willing, on the basis of what is essentially more preclinical data, to make some of these bets and put down reasonable amounts of upfront, still heavily backloaded. And this also is happening in the immunotherapy space with the sheer amount of activity around checkpoint inhibitors, and with most of the noise right now being around the PD-1s, and there being only a limited number of those in a few select hands, with two really at the forefront vying with each other, the BMS, who already is established in the space, with Yervoy and, of course, Merck. And so you can start to see types of deals that are being done when people have kind of other agents broadly in the category of checkpoint or immunomodulatory targets, where someone has some early preclinical data with potential, doesn't even have to be differentiation from something like a PD-1 or CTLA-4, because we all know that many of these checkpoints affect different aspects of the interaction of the immune system between the APCs, the NK cells, and the T cells, and the Tregs, et cetera. So, most of the field believes that these will benefit from combinations, and so you can see interesting deals done early on, whether this ex-US deal, Macrogenics on their B7H3 monoclonal, or, I probably should put in the Bayer deal that was done with the very early stage two novel checkpoint inhibitors that Compugen has surfaced as a result of their interesting discovery programs. So clearly, this emphasizes both the idea of a lot of chasing of similar targets, or the hot targets, which is kind of analogous to what Bruce Booth was saying about the VEGFs. But some of these targets are very, very exciting and have, potential game-changing applications, like the checkpoint inhibitors and the data that they've been generating. But it also suggests that in many of these hot areas, if you have early data that suggests either an inherent value proposition or differentiation from other agents in the class, whether already approved or still in development, that one can do early deals. And so that's kind of the natural segue here to talking about some of the deal making in the space. I'm going to go through this kind of relatively quickly, but needless to say, oncology really does continue to be at the top in terms of overall deal makings, whether through our analysis using Evaluate Pharma data that we had done using the 2012 data, or when one looks at external sources like Thomson Reuters, now Recap's part of Thomson Reuters, so they just did this presentation just a week ago, roughly a week ago, and you can see again that oncology is at the top in terms of M&A, and certainly the top in terms of the average deal size for these deals, and that it continues to lead in terms of licensing compared to many other categories. And in fact, the 2013 was a tremendous lead over other areas, because there have been years where the Vying of cancer and increasingly autoimmune inflammatory have been much closer. And in fact, when you look at it, not just the total number of deals or dollars, you look at it kind of plotted this way, again, from Thomson Reuters, from the recent webinar, you can kind of see kind of how close autoimmune inflammatory and oncology are to each other, and how outsized they are relative to many other categories over the past several years. I think it's interesting when you look back in time and see points where they were kind of much closer, kind of broadly all of the therapeutic categories, but kind of this separations that started to occur around 2011 and just has continues to be so. It was very outsized in 2012, but and many of those deals, although I don't have the specific new data in terms of where by phase in oncology, I do have previous analyses up through 2012 showing that a lot of these, as I alluded to before, are happening in early stage, meaning really pre-POC, pre-phase 2. So you can see the degree on the left there of those blues between lead molecules and preclinical and phase 1. That's a hefty percentage of deal activity in oncology. So that gives a lot of hope for the smaller biotechs, but it doesn't mean that one doesn't have to do the smart prioritization of targets, the smart delineation of where the unmet needs are and what the patient segments are, so that one can do kind of the killer experiments, whether those are in the animal model or in the appropriate kind of early phase 1/2 studies, in order to elicit partnering interest. It goes without saying that the novel targets, particularly novel targets in a very hot area like immunotherapy or epigenetics or stem cells, will have an advantage, and those that are kind of outside the easy boxes will have a greater burden of proof. But nonetheless, there remains this hunger for early stage targets, novel targets, obviously targets that have data that's suggestive of some meaningful effect, whether that's in a specific tumor type or with some broad application across multiple tumor types, which of course is one of the appeals right now to immunotherapy. At least for the moment, it's envisioned as being kind of broadly applicable, although it's clear that certain patients do respond better than others. So there may come a point where kind of that patient stratification starts to occur in the application and development of immunotherapies as well. So just in closing then, I think that it's important to bear in mind that there are a lot of potential advantages and a lot of opportunities that precision medicine can bring in the face of these crowded and increasingly crowded markets and the noise of all the different agents, as well as to strengthen the value proposition in a time when pricing pressures are increasing, and that increase will only accelerate. But at the same time, that application of precision medicine or personalized medicine or biomarker strategies is not always as easy as one might make it out to be, given the complexity of tumors, not just the variance from one tumor in one patient to another, and which particular driver mutation or mutations are responsible for a particular patient's cancer, but also how that cancer is inherently diverse and maybe have different segments with different mutations driving components, and at the end of the day, certainly it is dynamic over time, so that heterogeneity exists and may increase, and of course the plasticity under selective pressure of treatment. So the need for all those crowding of agents and mechanisms and tumor types, the flip side, of course, is that's necessary in order to get enough products and programs out at the end of the day to have sufficient armamentarium to address this very, very dynamic and heterogeneous and plastic foe. And so, I think as we continue to move into new realms of diagnostic technologies and the cost and speed of doing just genome sequencing, whether whole genome or exome sequencing, but at the end of the day, those data in and of themselves are not enough, because we don't know, which of those mutations are significant. When they show up and we have drugs that are on the shelf already, that's great, and at least we have something that we believe we can hang our hats on in terms of managing the patients. But in many cases, we don't necessarily know with current technologies, which of those are meaningful, and let alone, many of those mutations that may not yet be actionable because there are no drugs, or they may even be targets that are inherently more problematic and less druggable, at least historically, which is why there's increasing interest in other types of approaches, and we've seen lots of deal-making, people getting into again, spaces like siRNA. But at the end of the day, being able to determine which of these changes are really driving and which are actionable as distinguished from those that may be either minor players or passengers will be important, and whether that gets done through unique animal model systems, et cetera, it is where the field will continue to need to move beyond just this static snapshot of what mutations the patient has. And of course, as I said, there are many of these targets or target buckets that are less readily addressed, and so new platforms will continue to be needed moving forward. And certainly we've seen a lot of interesting deals and new companies arising, say, just around the platform of CAR T cells between the Bluebirds and Juno and the work and the deals and partnerships that Celgene and Novartis and others are doing, and as well as I said, more recent deal making in siRNA or in other kind of RNA targeting devices like block nucleic acids or next generation antisense and so on. So the idea of needing continued new platforms, and some of these are lower hanging fruit, covalent modifications, and others are more kind of moonshots, if you will. But one thing is sure, that we do need to have a broad and deep armamentarium in oncology because of the nature of the inherent and acquired resistance that these tumors can display. And again, whether these are analogies to evolution in oncology or analogies to resistance in bacterial colonies, nonetheless, it is a dynamic situation. So we do need to have kind of continued extensive investment. But hopefully, as KOLs will say to us time and again, when we're either evaluating specific programs or doing strategic projects for our clients, they are looking for, things that are, have good biologic rationale, and the biology is being well studied, and there's a good story for it, and so there's biological relevance, and that's the underpinning, not just the fact that it happens to be a novel target or a novel platform to hit a given target. So that emphasis on biologic relevance is very important. And so at the end of the day, hopefully we'll be able to kind of look back at all the changes that have been happening, well, they started, a decade or more ago, but have only been accelerating. Hopefully in 10 years' time, we'll be able to kind of look back and hopefully, not quite like the tricorder system that Bones could wave over the patient, but hopefully we'll have many new and novel advances to address some of these remaining challenges in oncology. So I want to thank everyone for their time, and if there are any questions, we have just a couple of minutes, and of course, if the questions come up to you afterwards, you can please feel free to reach out and email us separately. We do hope that you will consider coming to Cancer Progress, particularly if any of you are on the East Coast, and it's a ready trip to New York City, because it is an amazing collection of speakers that we have on the panels, moderating the panels across many of these hot button issues in oncology, whether targets, cancers, or kind of higher order issues such as immunotherapy, brain cancers. I talked about kind of the role of data that will be on Colin Hill's panel, or issues with diagnostics, or investments in cancer, the changes in prostate cancer, which is a highly dynamic space now, the issues of value in oncology, and the pricing issues, which will be an interesting, I'll call it a trilogue between Dr. Bach, Haslam, and Hudis. Of course, the issues of ADCs and cell and gene therapies that are increasingly important within the toolkit and the market in oncology. The issue of resistance, which is so critical, that Neil Rosen will be chairing, and that should be a very interesting session. One session that now Saul Bearer will be chairing around challenging established paradigms in cancer, trying to get people to kind of think out of the box, not just for the fun of it, but to make sure we're not kind of somehow having some conceptual lapse or missing something in terms of discovery or development or utilization of drugs for cancer, and then closing out with discussion around the challenges, the benefits, and what remains to be done in terms of translating actual discovery targets through efficiently and optimally through the clinic and ultimately to bedside. So with that, I again thank everyone for their time and look forward to hearing from you, if not seeing you at Cancer Progress and or at the EBD's BioEurope Spring meeting in Italy, both in March. So busy March. All right, thanks everyone.
This concludes today's session. We know a lot of you who are on the line are clients, and thank you for joining us. And for those of you who we don't know, we'll be reaching out to introduce ourselves on an individual basis. Jeff's slides will be up on the website within a day or two. Please give us a call if you have any questions or thoughts. Thank you.